there's a powerful lesson there about how spiritual, people talk about spiritual but not religious. I think one of the defining characteristics of what is it that distinguishes one from the other, one of them is about being non-dogmatic, being non-sectarian, having an approach to spirituality and spiritual experience that is not predicated first on demanding faith as an entry point into any form of realization.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Come on!
Live from Super Soul Farm in Cana, New York. This is Wisdom of the Sages, a daily spiritual podcast with your host, Raghunath. Kostuba's on break today. Welcome to the show. It's June 8th, 2025, and it's Sunday. This is episode 1621, everybody. And it is Sleep-In Sunday. That means you get an extra hour to sleep in on the weekends. It's 8 o'clock. And it is interview day, and we have a great one of these higher beings on the show today. But before we bring him on, Miss Mara, do you have some announcements for us?
I don't, but if people want to come, I know you're at Berkshire Yoga Fest. Are there still tickets available for that?
Berkshire Yoga Fest.
Yeah,
there might be a few.
Okay.
Yeah.
How would people find that? Berkshire Yoga Fest.
BerkshireYogaFest.com. Google that.
Okay.
But yeah,
that's coming up this week on June 12th.
Yeah,
13th.
It's almost sold out, or it is sold out. But you could check, or they might have day passes. I teach Thursday and Friday. Thursday night, Krishna Das is singing with us. Cool. Looking forward to that. And then Saturday is the big New York Ratha-yatra, and we encourage every one of our listeners to come down. If you've never experienced it, it is really mind-blowing. It's like you feel like Bhakti is taking over the world as you sing and chant, pulling giant carts of deities down Fifth Avenue. And then you end up in Washington Square Park, and you got to come and hang with us at our Wisdom of the Sages table, where we will be singing and distributing cookies. If you like to make some prasadam cookies, make some vegan cookies, offer them to God or Krishna, and then we'll distribute cookies. We'll do prasad distribution, kirtan, book distribution. It'll be great, meeting people and just making our family, who's a lot of times only either never met each other or seen each other only online, in person, hanging out in New York City, the Big Apple, the city that never sleeps.
It'll be a fun day.
Yeah. And I want to say I'm taking a group on pilgrimage November 28th. We got a good
October
29th. How did I get a month and a day off? October 29th for 2 weeks to holy places in India. Really looking forward. If you're interested, go to raghunath.yoga, raghunath.yoga for more information. And while you're on my website, click on the Super Soul Farm tab, and you will see all the retreats we're doing at the farm. We just had a 7-hour kirtan, which was really quite fun. Wonderful, organized by Seth and Cody, who are our regular listeners and friends. Yeah, it's just a great day. Mara cooked a out-of-the-park feast of Mara and Bunky. We'll give Bunky some credit.
Too, yeah.
Mara, you made this meat-like taco filling out of what?
Cauliflower and walnuts.
Yeah. Sometimes if you're going to think of substitute meat, you're going to get some like gluten-based, chemicalized something or other, rubbery meat thing. This was like cauliflower and walnuts, and I put that in your recipe. She's making a Wisdom of the Sages cooking recipe book. This should go in there. Because you knocked it out of the park with that one.
Maybe I'll put those cookies in there too.
And these cookies, these vegan gluten-free cookies were next. What were they? Peanut butter chocolate?
Yeah, peanut butter chocolate chip.
Home run.
All right.
We're going to bring on a guest who's been on before. Please welcome Navin Krishna, also known as Nitesh Gor. Navin, welcome to the show. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much. Wonderful to be back again.
And you're live in London. Is that correct?
Correct.
Nitesh Gor, a.k.a. You know, it's interesting because in America, when we get a spiritual name, our names are like Roy, Larry, Charlie, and then we get a spiritual name Madhavapriya Das or Madhu Mangal or something like exotic and foreign. But you go from a very spiritual Indians when they get initiated, they get your name is already very Nitesh Gor. So if you understand Sanskrit, you have this beautiful name, and then you get another name on top of that name. So and even the birth name reminds us of Krishna or the Lord or the controller or a holy planet or something. But Nitesh Gor, his initiated name is Navin Krishna. And we had him on the show previously for creating this incredible value, integrity based not private school, it's a charter school in England. And how many schools are there?
We have 12 schools.
12 schools. It's very, very impressive. And you can look into that. But today we're going to focus on his book that came out. And it's called, Mara, where's my Before Religion. It's a very provocative title. Before Religion, Ancient India's Reconciling Vision for Universal Spirituality. And I want to pick his brain because there's a need for this. It seems like if you want to have some type of spiritual principles, you're going to lean into one of these spiritual traditions, but it seems like there's a lot of conflicting information. And I'll just play the devil's advocate a little bit. Even if I said, I like for myself, I listen to Christian sermons sometimes. I get some inspiration from them. I listen to, I'll read the Bible, or I'll cross-reference other spiritual books on wisdom or great philosophers. But sometimes after I feel like I really want to embrace Christianity. I go with my mother to church. I sing gospels on Christmas. But I got a feeling they wouldn't embrace me as a Hare Krishna. That's my deepest feeling. Like a lot of times I'll even follow some Christian preachers on Instagram. I was like, that's a pretty good point. That's a pretty good point. But I feel like if they had their way, would they tolerate us? We're like, well, we're into you guys too. You know what I'm saying? Are they it doesn't seem like within Islam, at least in general, or in Christianity, that they really want us as Hare Krishnas. It more seems like they want us to follow our path. Can you explain the difference between inclusivism and exclusive religious paths?
Wow. Yeah, you jumped right in.
I'm going to jump into the deep water. First of all, welcome. How are you?
No, that's fantastic. I love it. Because the question that you just posed there, as challenging as it is I think is also extremely exciting, because I think this is where the opportunity lies. What you've articulated there is precisely the reason why I was inspired to write the book. I feel that the Vedic perspective, in particular the Srimad Bhagavatam, has something very powerful to say about this. And I think what you're identifying there, in terms of this potential kind of exclusivism that comes with a lot of religious practice, belief, and tradition, is as a result of viewing religion through a particular lens. And I think the Bhagavatam offers a different lens. And that's why I think its message is so important and so powerful. And the book zeroes in on the 4 seed verses of the Bhagavatam in terms of identifying that as a framework through which we can understand the idea of universal spirituality through the eyes of the Bhagavatam. And the point you make about reconciling this idea of fidelity to a particular tradition and at the same time being accepted, not just, you use the word tolerating. And I think that's kind of where we end up in
Yeah.
is that we end up at a level of let's just tolerate each other as opposed to going a bit beyond that.
Like I feel like I understand after reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, I fully feel like I understand the Bible better than I did when I was a kid and I went to Sunday school. That being said, and I can go there, I can sing these songs with great faith, Christ was the guru showing people. By the way, never tell a Christian Christ is the guru. They will lose their mind. But Christ is delivering people to God. He's saying this world is temporary. It's don't get caught up in the lust and the greed and the passions of this world. Give your life, give your heart, give your mind, give your thoughts as an offering to God. I get that. That being said, I can sing with with all my passion and fervor. That being said, I cannot imagine a group of Christians pulling the Ratha-yatra cart down Fifth Avenue and singing Jai Jagannath. And this is it. How do we get this very, very big theistic communities?
Yeah.
Islam is huge.
Yeah.
It's huge in England. Islam is huge in America. Christianity is huge throughout the world. How do you get them to not tolerate us, but say, you know what? You got some good points there. What will be the shift? It seems like Christianity's shift was when there became an emperor in Rome. And then all of a sudden, paganism's wiped out practically overnight. Emperor Constantine established, well, we got a new religion, and this is going to follow our massive expansion of territory, and this is the state religion. Get it or get out. And then, of course, we see the invasion of, Spain and Portugal and, the Middle East and Iran and India with Islam. And it was really converting with the sword. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of like my way or the highway, or more like my way or I'm going to cut your head off. Mm-hmm. And so do we see that within Hinduism? Is it going to be by the sword? How can you make it a cultural conquest? Because it seems like I think people here get into, like, that our listeners, they get into this, as crazy as it sounds, sometimes we get into it for as trite as a reason of like, wow, a pakora, that's delicious. Tell me about prashad. Or we get into it because of Indian dance or Ayurvedic medicine or an exercise we call yoga that makes my mind calm. So it almost seems like there's a cultural conquest. Did I give too many questions within my long-winded? Please jump in, because I'll just keep talking and I will not get an answer to any of these questions.
Okay, so let me start. I think like at the beginning of what you said there, in terms of how do we shift kind of perspective on this. And I think one of the reasons, like I used, you may not be able to see it so clearly there, but I used an elephant, or an abstracted elephant, on the cover of the book, because the ancient Indian story, and there's a reason why it comes from ancient India, because of this pluralistic approach to spirituality, this idea that when different people are approaching the elephant and touching different parts of the elephant, oblivious to what other people are experiencing in what they're touching. Somebody's touching the tusk, somebody's the trunk, somebody's the leg, somebody's the tail, etc. And they're all expressing very, very different experiences, and it's virtually impossible for them to accept or to acknowledge that somebody else may be experiencing something very different in contact with what is ultimately the same thing. So that is where, like, that perspective, that framework, that approach to truth is different in the Vedic tradition. It is acknowledging this idea that I can have an experience from a particular perspective about reality, which is different to yours. And until I have the concept of an elephant, it's very hard for me to reconcile what you're saying, touching something that feels like the trunk of a tree when I'm touching something that feels like a snake. It's very hard for me to accept your perspective unless I understand the concept of an elephant. And then all of a sudden it becomes a heck of a lot easier. So I think that's where the Bhagavatam's perspective on different perspectives on reality, different perspectives on truth. And, just one other point correlated to this is that's also why in the Vedic tradition, the disciplines of theology or religion, philosophy, and science were not three separate disciplines that were mutually exclusive in the way that we've understood them in the Western world. So in the Western world, we have like this complete separation of these three things. But if you
Mm,
look at them fundamentally, all of them are in their own way trying to approach truth, trying to
mm.
approach the fundamental reality of our experience. And it's so fascinating to me. I have a kind of science education background, uh, and I love philosophy, and I'm practicing religion. So like this idea of how these three things come together in a very powerful way coming from the Vedic tradition, because it doesn't it doesn't force us into false dichotomies, this truth versus that truth, but actually looks for how do these different truths reconcile. And I think that's something that, that's a skill, actually. It's a skill which is well, desperately lacking in the world today.
Desperately lacking, causing a lot of tribalism and hate, not looking for commonality, but really focusing on differences. So this is my big question. We get it. We're enlightened. How do we get these, if it, and we can appreciate that people want to understand there is a higher truth, there's higher power, there are moral laws and codes, and how to make them relevant and practical, even the ancient ones, which seem sort of antiquated. How do we get these other spiritual paths, and not just the fringes of those paths, to say, you know what, I'm in love with my particular tradition, but I understand that God is one, and that all these are meant to bring us to some higher truths, higher reality, and higher connection. How do we do that? Is it just through these interfaith dialogues? Part of me doesn't feel like that's going to work,
Mm.
And so, like I was saying in part two of my question was, is it a religious conquest? Because that's how Christianity and Islam have went about it. Would Hindus or Vedic culture, have they taken up the sword, or has it always been a cultural conquest? Because India, the culture of the Vedas, at one point you can see it historically, at least, they see these fire or these deities of Shiva they found in Russia, and fire Agni worship they found in in Siberia, and they found, like, of course, the biggest Vishnu temple in the world is in Cambodia. And of course, you have these places like Myanmar, which once was Burma, which came from Brahma. Then you have like Singapore. These are Sanskrit words. They found a massive protected in digging a shopping mall in Indonesia. They unearthed a perfectly intact Vedic temple that was covered over in lava, and so we see that Vedic culture was spread throughout the world, or at
Mm.
least a broad part of the world. Was that also a conquest through war? Through the sword? Was it a cultural conquest? Can you explain historically?
I from from my reading of scriptural texts which talk about the history of how Vedic civilization was spread around the world. Um, it's interesting because I don't see any reference to religious conversion in the way that you're referring to there. So it's not to say that there weren't battles fought and there was no war. For sure there was. But it wasn't about religious conversion. And I think part of the reason is because if you look at ancient India as a civilization, it was a pluralistic society, right? So like there wasn't one theology or one
Mm.
practice or one form of religious experience that was being promoted or pushed onto the population to the exclusion of others. And I think even if you just read the Bhagavad Gita, which is only 700 verses, right? Like, and its explanation of the yoga ladder, or the kind of system of yoga, that
Mm.
just there tells you that there is an acknowledgement of different perspectives on reality.
Yeah, it seems like we want everything or nothing. This binary concept of God. It's either there's a God, and generally there's a God, and it's my version of that, or there's nothing. And that's what you get into, like, on college campuses. This guy, fighting for, there's a God, there's Jesus, Jesus will save you. Or you got these, like, kids who are just screaming, "There's no God. How can you say this? Follow the science, etc." What do you say to people who just say, "Just, yeah, follow the science"?
Uh,
You're a
sorry.
scientist. Come on. You really believe God was created? God, Lord, Brahma, a four-headed being, came out of a lotus on a giant man sleeping on an ocean. Can't we just? We're intelligent people. Can't we just accept this as fascinating creation myths? But really, it's these moral codes we're meant to follow. Why are you so literal about everything? Why can't we just see this as these are ancient books of wisdom, and we have to sort of hand select these things? Of course, they're myths. Come on, we're rational human beings. We understand that we're rational people. Why must we accept your fantasy stories, your Star Wars, so to speak, as reality? Come on, let's extract some practical truths and lead a mature life where we respect each other. What is your problem, Nitesh? You're such a fundamentalist.
Uh, so look. I think there's a few things there, right? So there is something there about actually what does science know and what does science not know. I think there is what's really fascinating and interesting is that there is a lot of bad science out there. So like popular science versus science which physicists, the leading physicists of the world have been talking about for decades, if
Mm,
not centuries, identifying this idea that actually consciousness, I mean, this, I'm just giving an example,
sure.
consciousness being a fundamental part of our reality. Now, this is something which is being endorsed now by some of the leading atheists in the world. But this idea that consciousness is not emergent from uh, molecular complexity, which is taught in schools around the world. So
Mm,
it's I think even if you, and that's what I mean by science, philosophy, and religion coming at the search for truth. That the Vedic understanding is that you can go through any of these disciplines, and if you go thoroughly and sincerely and deep enough, you will arrive at truth. So the scientific approach is not contradictory to the Vedic approach. And to your point then about, some of these creation myths or fantastical stories,
mm.
just by sheer coincidence, it seems, though we don't believe in coincidence, but like there is just this morning, I read a text from the Bhagavatam, which I'll try and recollect. It's the second canto, chapter 10, verse 45, if I have that right. And that verse from the Bhagavatam says, of all the various stories of which the Vedic stories that talk about Krishna's direct intervention into the world and essentially the creation types stories, they are told just so that we do not think that material nature is acting independently.
Mm,
And that was striking to me because it's essentially saying that there is a literal understanding and a reading of spiritual texts. Of course, there is, but there is also a metaphorical understanding of these spiritual texts. It's not one or the other. Again, it's avoiding the false dichotomy here. And
uh-huh.
to the point about science versus religion versus philosophy, these things can be and are reconciled in the Vedic tradition.
Yeah. Truthfully, it's when people ask me that question, I mean, we have a pretty fantastic creation myth. The Norse also have theirs, and the Aztecs have theirs, the Mayans have theirs, and it's all quite fantastic. But
Mm.
nothing seems more fantastic than
Exactly.
everything came from nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that is pretty fantastic. All variety, all form, a peacock, a pigeon, a sugar maple tree, a brick, everything that you can imagine. Blue eyes, blonde hair. It all came from nothing. Now, come on, that it doesn't get more fantastic than that.
Yeah, and I'll give you an example of what I was thinking about when you're speaking just there, is that in the Rig Veda there's a text, and that text talks about um, that the sun travels on a chariot, and then it says
Yeah,
the
that's
chariot,
fantastic. By the way,
right?
even today when I read that, I was like, it's a little fantastic.
Yeah, but like, so the sun is being pulled by these seven horses.
Right.
It gives the speed at which that sun travels in the blink of an eye.
Right.
So that's how fast the chariot's traveling. Now, so obviously, when you read that at one level, it seems like out there with
Children's story.
yeah, like just um, purely fantastical. But we know because of I forget what it was, a 12th century commentary on that text,
Yeah.
which then describes how that is referring to the speed of light, right? So you multiply out the blink of the duration of the blink of an eye to the duration the distance it says it's traveling in that time. You talk about the seven horses in terms of being the colors that make up sunlight, and you get within a couple of percent of the modern understanding of the speed of light. So and this is exactly what I
Pretty
mean.
fascinating. Pretty fascinating.
And
You're
that's what I mean, that you can understand this and see it from different levels of, if you're metaphorically inclined, scientifically inclined, philosophically inclined, religiously inclined, whichever way that you're looking at that truth, you're approaching that truth just in the way that I'm touching part of the elephant and you're touching another part.
it's not faith-based. It almost seems like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it almost seems like we're saying like, here's an example of what you can become. Take a
Mhm.
tiny step forward and
Mhm.
try to apply it. And then if it makes sense, if you get the results of that experiment, take another tiny step forward, which is an experience-based practice.
Yeah.
Whereas we're not saying you just believe, you just trust, you just give your life and everything, and then there'll be a reward in heaven. Of
Yeah.
course, there is. Whenever you turn your life from like I was living on the streets and I was selling my body or whatever horrible thing I was doing, and now I've become a little bit a little zipped up, there will be a relief from material distress. I get that, but it seems like there is big leaps of faith, whereas the Vedic tradition can get into gritty details like the speed of light in a 12th century text. Come on. It is truly the blending of the science meets faith, or reason. I like to call reasonable faith.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And if you look at the structure of the principal texts within the Vedic tradition, the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam are prime examples. They are
Mm,
structured as questions and answers. Now, you can't structure a text in that way unless you are willing to do exactly what you said, which is start from a place of a priori faith, right? Like, so like we're not assuming faith. Krishna is not assuming faith in the beginning of the Gita, where in chapter 2, where he's giving analogies and logic and metaphor to be able to explain the notion of a spiritual self within the body, the embodied. And interestingly, he doesn't even use the word or an equivalent word of soul
mm.
in that description. And at the end of that description, around text 25 or something like that, he says to Arjuna, and even if you don't believe in this, even if you think that life begins with birth and ends with death, even then you have no reason to lament.
Lament,
So
because you're going to
he,
die anyway.
yeah, well, he's acknowledging in that after that entire description, he's acknowledging the fact that that belief system existed at that time, that not everybody believed in the
Not
eternal.
everybody will believe that.
So there's a powerful lesson there about how spiritual, people talk about spiritual but not religious. I think one of the defining characteristics of what is it that distinguishes one from the other, one of them is about being non-dogmatic,
Mm.
being non-sectarian, having an approach to spirituality and spiritual experience that is not predicated first on demanding faith as an entry point into any form of realization.
I keep wanting to push this point, like you to give me some prophetic answer about how we're going to get these mass fundamentalist religions to accept that there's other truths out there. But maybe that's not the question, because it's not like the Roman Empire, which extended all the way to Germany and England, and um, it's not like they were like, okay, let's. From what I understand, it was pretty. As soon as they got the emperor, that was the deal. This is the new religion of the state. Maybe things can just shift and have these just exponential changes like immediately, like a massive paradigm shift.
Yeah.
You have an opinion on that?
I I want to approach it from a slightly different perspective, and that is that I feel that in any tradition, it's because it's something I write about in the book. In any tradition, including the Vedic tradition,
Mm,
you will get those fundamentalists. You will get an approach which is
sure.
dogmatic. You will get an approach which is narrow and secular, and and I think therefore one of the things that I think will be helpful is to move from the perspective of interfaith to intrafaith. I think
Ooh,
there is more similarity between traditions of people at their respective levels of spiritual progression in their own traditions. I think there's more similarity there than
mm,
with the same tradition, but at very different levels. So I think there is um, a really important message there about how a non-sectarian view on spirituality would come at that question.
sure, sure. Okay, I have a question on the message board from Danny that I'm going to stop my flow of questioning and just ask. She's a very thoughtful person, so I wanted to give you a chance to answer this. She's asked, Krishna consciousness views Christ with deep respect as a teacher of God consciousness whose emphasis on loving God aligns with our principles. Are there many devotees that embrace both religions? I've been reading and researching and see so many parallels between both. Do you think it's true that devotees do embrace both religions? And what does that mean to embrace both religions?
Exactly. I think that's the underlying question. Yeah. So I think you gave the example of yourself, right? Like just being appreciating um, teachings from the Christian tradition. I know I have the same experience. I know many other devotees who
Mm,
similarly have that affinity towards the teachings of Jesus Christ, and Srila Prabhupada himself in many different places acknowledges the same. And then the question then is, okay, well, how do I incorporate that within my own practice of, let's say, the bhakti tradition? Does it have a role in there, or are there any kind of like essentially points of inspiration? And I think that there was a beautiful conversation that Swami Prabhupada had about Joan of Arc, and he mentioned, his reference point was Joan of Arc of the Bhagavatam, and his idea was wherever there is uh, teachings or kind of stories about the Supreme and the devotee, that is the Bhagavatam. So there's the
wow.
Bhagavatam from the perspective of, the 12 cantos and the thousands of verses across those 12 cantos, the book itself. But then there's the concept of the Bhagavatam. And Srila Prabhupada himself refers to Christian saints as being part of that Bhagavad tradition. So I think that's
Sure.
an important aspect here.
That could be the intra-faith you're talking about.
Exactly.
You
You know,
sort I like that a lot. Um, yeah, wherever we're, I see this a lot. We have a lot of people who came to Bhakti through the recovery program as well. And we're big supporters of Jiva and the Bhakti Recovery Group. And who are these people that start these programs? Like Bill Wilson, the person who started uh, the 12 steps. Like, where did he get this from? Stuff that's actually getting people off like very, very heavy drugs, alcohol. Where is he getting and turning them on to spirit, truth, completely changing their life? And not just when I say completely change, I mean, not just getting them off drugs and alcohol. They see that as a secondary thing. They see that as a blessing to get them close to God. So, who is this person that gets divinely inspired? That can't be outside Krishna's realm. If we're trying to understand this, that means that person has some Shakti of the Lord. That's what we would call a Shakti avatar. Now, me and Kostu always argue this point. I say he's a Shakti avatar. He says, how can you say that? But I just say, because the proof is in the pudding. He's turning people onto devotees of God.
yeah,
So in one sense, it is a step outside of our window, at least what we know our window to be. But let's face it, once we turn the focus off ourself as the center and turn it as some higher authority as the center, that's getting towards Sanatan Dharma. Would you say?
Yeah, and yeah, for sure. And I think the um just shining a mirror to this point around, is it logically consistent or reasonable even that any tradition can have a monopoly on truth, right? And I think most reasonable people, regardless of their faith tradition, would acknowledge that it doesn't make sense. So I think you will always have people in that vertical of a
Mm,
tradition who will believe that it makes absolute sense for it to be exclusively available to people of my club. But
mm,
I think anyone of any uh, maturity in that spiritual tradition will acknowledge that truth has to be wider than this, particular practice or name that we call it. So I think just putting on display, showing and sharing the idea, making a reasonable claim on this, I think will appeal not to everyone, but I think it does appeal to people just who are open-minded.
sure. Yeah. Now I have $1 million question for you. $1 million question for you, my friend. How do we keep ourselves? Now we're loyal to a path.
Mm.
We might have been on some spiritual path. I might have been an alcoholic or a drug addict or a Christian, but now I'm a bhakti yoga. I chant the holy name. There's particular rules we follow. There's certain practices that we have, regular practices on a regular basis. How do I keep myself from being a fundamentalist where my way is the way and negating all these other people? How do I keep that? Now, part of it is woven into our teachings, but still we see people practicing bhakti developing this this almost an intolerance with other traditions or skeptical or this is bogus and this is not bona fide. How can we create a broader mind and say, because you see it happen, especially if you're part of this institution or this particular sangha or this particular math, things tend to get very exclusive. We start to follow a particular guru and we start to negate everything else. How do we protect ourselves from becoming fundamentalists, yet staying chaste to a tradition?
Yeah, and that's the challenge. I think uh, as an image, if you think about the shape of an hourglass, right? So it's broad at the top, it kind of starts to narrow at the middle, and
Mm,
then it goes broad again. So I really like that image as a response to the question you're asking, because I think right at the top it's real broad. And by the top here, I'm talking about the very superficial approach to spirituality and religion, which is like essentially everyone just be a good person and you make statements that nobody can really argue against because you're not saying anything substantial.
sure.
So that top layer of, yeah. And then as you enter that and you associate yourself with a particular tradition, it starts to narrow. And some would argue that necessarily so, because that narrowing is a form of commitment. For me, I can't focus on a million things at once. I need to focus on a couple of things. So that focus necessitates a certain exclusion of other things, which are at this moment in time a distraction for me. So
Mm,
therefore, there's a gradual narrowing as I commit myself to a particular path, to particular practices, particular teachings, like you said, right? So you start to go narrow. But then as you deepen in that spiritual tradition, the Vedic view is that any genuine spiritual tradition, as you progress and deepen your experience of that tradition, you will start to broaden your perspective. You will start to broaden the vision with which you engage with that and understand and see and be able to link with um, spiritual traditions outside of your own. And I think the test of that, as you said, the test of the pudding, I mean, the test of that is those spiritual, uh, highly advanced individuals. We see that perspective from them. We see that ability uh, to not have to give up any sense of fidelity or with their own traditional path, but at the same time accept and embrace the value of other spiritual paths. So I think just bearing that in mind as we practice our tradition, our own traditions, to your point, how do we broaden our minds? I think
Mm,
bearing that in mind that yes, I might be zeroing in on this at this moment in time from the perspective of it's good for me. I need it, not because it's the absolute truth, not because it's the final destination, but because I need that focus right now. But
mm.
looking to the example of those highly elevated spiritual teachers and gurus who've come before us to kind of see what was their vision, what was their perspective. And there we will see Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, Srila Prabhupada, like we will see a vision that is so broad that, you know, as we say, he built a house in which the whole world can live. What does that mean? It means
Sure.
that, it can accommodate different perspectives.
And that I love that quote because I've been using it a lot lately because oftentimes within institutions, you can build a house that only a few people can live in.
Yeah.
And even those people that are living there, are they really even qualified to live in that house? We try to make it so tight that it's like, who can live? Who can play this game? The bar is either too high or it seems like there's got to be sometimes that so many hoops we have to jump through just to love God. And it seems like it shouldn't be that. So this way of thinking, your book, it has to be incorporated, not just for people who are just sort of like curious about spirituality, but I think for people who are already practicing spirituality to protect themselves against their own fundamentalism. Eh,
Yeah.
Was this a massive undertaking? I mean, it's a book. It must have been. And what sort of like prompted you? I got to write a book about this.
Yeah. Um, Actually, what prompted me was related to the schools. So what happened was we have 7 faith schools that have a religious designation, and then we have 5 other schools which are community schools, but they share the same spiritual ethos.
Mm,
And so therefore the challenge that came to us, which we started this conversation with, which I said was a really exciting challenge, is how do we make spirituality real and tangible and not just superficial and tokenistic in a non religious sectarian context. So
mm,
that was the challenge. And so during the COVID lockdown year, I had time to reflect on that, and that's essentially I started writing and compiling my thoughts and reflections on my reading of the Bhagavatam as a response to that challenge. And
mm.
over the course of that year, it essentially developed into took the form essentially of a book.
Yeah, I love how you started off on Amazon. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Um, on Amazon, it starts off, "You're not as great as you think you are. You are far, far greater." Before religion is a treasure hunt through the oldest philosophical and spiritual text known to humankind. Just even that statement alone, it invites people because it's not like we're like waving a flag behind a book. We're waving a flag behind a culture of a library of books, canons of literature to help us elevate our consciousness. And they don't always line up together because that's the way like a tapestry works. Within a beautiful tapestry, there's different colors and different threads and different thicknesses that make one very beautiful painting.
Yeah.
Um, um, because you're a writer, because you're inspirational, and because you have a science background, first of all, I want to say I'm going to highly recommend everybody to get this book. Go to Amazon and get this, or wherever you get books. Again, it's called Before Religion: Ancient India's Reconciling Vision for Universal Spirituality. Did you do an audiobook on this?
Not yet, in the making.
Okay. Because I really consume a lot of my literature when I'm in a very focused place, generally driving my tractor, mowing the lawn, which is that's my regular consumption of great literature. But because you're an out of the box thinker, I would love to hear 3 books you'd recommend for summer reading for
Oh,
our audience. And maybe they can be more on like essential teachings. What do you like and why?
Wow. Okay. So I'm gonna okay, maybe I'll come at it from different perspectives. So one of the books I think is really I absolutely love it is C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters. Have you
I
read that?
downloaded that.
Yeah, have you read it?
We're thinking alike, you and me. You're completely educated and intellectual. I'm a punk from the Lower East Side, and we're coming together. This is commonality, my friend.
I absolutely love that book because it talks to, I think, a lot of what we've been talking about here, which is about how that one of you, I can see it there. Somebody's holding it up. So yeah, it's just a brilliant book because it's obviously C.S. Lewis was a Christian, and he talks about it from the perspective and what from the perspective of you know the traps that religious people can fall into. That's what I love
Sure.
about it. And I think it's true for all traditions. So yeah, that's one. Um, Another one, I'm thinking here about the different like so that's kind of a religious book. Maybe a philosophical book might be something like if you like fiction, Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. That's again a very powerful view on. I'm giving you the non-Casey books, but
No, that's okay. Yeah, we want we like to bring in a quote a day on the podcast on a regular weekly on the regular shows. We're reading the Bhagavatam. We start off with a quote, a wisdom nugget from a philosophical thinker, an inspirational writer. It could be from Shakespeare to Aristotle to Richard Rohr, and show the commonality in truth. And like as you say, which I also say all the time, no one's got a monopoly on truth. No religion has a monopoly on truth. It's like
yeah.
it's like math. It's not Jewish math, Hindu math, etc. Although there is Vedic math. But my point is, yes. So no, I like the how you're diving into other traditions because we want to sharpen our mind. And to have an intelligence like yours, I need to figure out what you're reading because I tend to be lame, and I need to up my game a little bit. And I ride a tractor a lot, and so and when I ride a tractor, other people are driving to work. Other people are there is always downtime for the mind, and if I don't put in something that's going to sharpen my intelligence, I'm going to put me into something that dulls my intelligence or distracts me from truth, or even worse, gets me angry. There's nothing worse than like flicking on the TV or the Netflix or the news, and you just get off like, oh, I hate those guys now, and that
Mhm.
happens a lot. And we've created a culture of hate, and we've become almost like experts at creating a culture of hate and teasing people and baiting people forward. So please, next book.
Okay, so that's religion and philosophy is Dostoevsky's.
Okay.
That's kind of philosophy, psychology, and then
And
the third.
why do we want that book?
Oh yeah, because
Dostoevsky?
yeah, so I mean Dostoevsky of Western literature, I can't think of a better writer who reflects on the human condition. I mean, it is really very, very powerful how he reflects on the human condition and those forces that feel to impose upon the human condition. So he talks about it from a philosophical sense, a psychological sense, and it relates so closely with the Vedic tradition, I feel. And it yeah just shines a different light on it and it's a beautiful story.
He
um
was an Orthodox Christian?
yeah, he was Christian, yeah, Orthodox Russia, so yeah,
Yeah,
Orthodox, yeah,
like Tolstoy.
yeah, around, yeah. So that's the second one. And then
Okay.
the third one, maybe I'll just pick science. So you've got the breadth of religion, philosophy, and science. Science, I would say, oh, okay. So there's a book called The Matter with Things. It's by Ian McGilchrist. Now, there's a warning that comes with this book because it's about 1,500 pages long. And
Okay, I'm gonna take that one off the list. You got a Cliff Note version of that?
however,
You have a very quick YouTube video under a minute? I could
Ian
pass that book
McGilchrist.
with.
No, no, so just bear with me a second. I actually read it pretty much cover to cover. But the reason why I say that is because it is it's scary to look at, but it is absolutely brilliant. The way he scientifically, he's probably the world's leading expert on brain science, consciousness, etc. The way he breaks down the philosophical and scientific arguments for the existence and the fundamental nature of consciousness in a way which relates uh, almost not exactly, but almost with the Vedic tradition is very powerful. And he has clarity of thought and uses language which is accessible to anyone of any background, non-scientific background. And yeah, it's just very powerful. So anyway,
Okay, what's the name of that one again?
the matter with things.
The Matter with Things.
Under
Once you said scientific and 1,500 pages, that was my kryptonite right there. You lost me there. It's like if you could have just have said, "Hey, Raghunath, it's time to do your taxes." I would have been like, "Ugh."
However, the title, The Matter with Things, so I'll just end here. The Matter with Things actually points to a perspective that is totally overlapping with the Sankhya approach to the nature of reality. That's what he's talking about.
It's
When
a
he
very
says,
clever title. It's a very
very
clever
clever.
title. If you, as a devotee, if you say it 3 times, you're like, "Oh, that is
Yeah,
very clever. That is
yeah.
very clever." And guess what? That is the end of our show. I had about 5 more questions I wanted to ask you, but I'm hoping I can meet you in person. We never met, right?
Well, here's a story. About 25 years, maybe slightly more, you were in London and you gave a talk in at the Manor, and I was
Did
whatever I
I?
was, like 25 years old. And it was a really inspiring talk, and I still remember it to this day, in Prabhupada's quarters upstairs at the Manor, and I'm very grateful for that.
Wow. I've been. That's incredible.
Yeah.
I don't even remember it. But I'm glad you were. I'm glad you came, and I'm glad I got to re-meet you now. It's unfortunate because at 25, were you you're new into all this stuff then, or you were been around?
Early days, but I was involved with the Pandavasena youth group at the temple.
Okay, so you were, yeah, you're one of those guys that come out of nowhere, gets born, and already much more advanced than me spiritually. Yeah, people like you drive me crazy. Prabhu, thank you for joining us. Navin Krishna, also known as Nitesh Gor. Please check out his book.
I'll link it in the show notes.
We're going to link in the Beyond Religion. And thanks for already. Before Religion. 3 times. Before Religion. And we're waiting. I'm waiting for the audiobook, but I will actually read it as well, because I do actually read sometimes. I always joke that I don't. Mara will vouch for that. Thanks for joining us everywhere. I want everybody to get this book ASAP too, and write a comment on Amazon. It's Sunday. Have a great Sunday, everyone. And remember, Ratha-yatra is this Saturday, so we hope to see everybody at the Wisdom of the Sages table, singing, passing out cookies, hanging, getting to meet great people. It is a beautiful day for a beautiful day. Let the Krishna magic continue to flow, and a Maha Haribol.